Hi, this is Mrs. Chavez. Today we're starting the World War II and the Cold War. This is chapter 36 and we're on section 1. So there are three main ideas that I want you guys to take away from these PowerPoints that I'm going to be doing with you in these lectures. One is empire building. Germany, Italy, and Japan, all of them tried to build empires. They began their expansion by conquering other nations and dominating them politically and economically. This, of course, is one of the reasons why we have war during this time. Another one is the science and technology. There were far-reaching developments in science and technology that changed the course of World War II. Improvements in aircraft and tanks and submarines and the development of radar and, of course, the atomic bomb drastically altered the way wars were fought. And the other idea that I want you to take away with is economics. Fighting the Axis terror weakened the economies of Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and many other European countries. In contrast, when the U.S. entered the war, its economy grew sharply, and the strength of the American economy actually bolstered the Allied war effort. In order to understand World War II, you need to understand that it came as a result of the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. This treaty did not build a lasting peace. For one thing, the U.S., considered after the war to be the dominant nation in the world, rejected the treaty completely. The treaty punished Germany, and the defeated nations lost substantial territory and had severe restrictions placed on its military operations. As tough as these provisions were, the harshest was Article 231 from the treaty, known as the War Guilt Clause, which placed sole responsibility for the war on Germany's shoulders. As a result, Germany had to pay reparations to the Allies. This made the German people very resentful and, of course, wanting revenge on the rest of Europe and the United States. During the 1930s, Hitler played on the hopes and fears of the Western democracies. Each time the Nazi dictator grabbed new territory, he would declare an end to his demands, and peace seemed to be guaranteed until Hitler moved again. And this policy of appeasement did nothing to stop Hitler. It only emboldened him. After his moves into the Rhineland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, Hitler turned his eyes to Poland. After World War I, the Allies had cut out the Polish corridor from German territory to give Poland access to the sea. But in 1939, Hitler demanded that the Polish corridor be returned to the Germans. In order to understand the Pacific Front in World War II, you need to understand Japan's role in World War II. Japanese businesses had invested heavily in China's northeast province, Manchuria. It was an area that was rich in iron and coal. And remember, Japan had no mineral resources. They had no oil. In order to survive, they had to conquer other places that had these items that they needed. So in 1931, the Japanese army seized Manchuria despite objections from the Japanese parliament. The army set up a puppet government, and the Japanese engineers began arriving in large numbers to build mines and factories. The Japanese attack on Manchuria was the first direct challenge to the League of Nations. In the early 1930s, the League's members included all major democracies except the United States, who did not join the League of Nations after World War I. The League also included the three countries that posed the greatest threat to peace: Germany, Japan, and Italy. When Japan seized Manchuria, many League members protested. Japan ignored the protests and basically withdrew from the League in 1933. 4 years later, a border incident touched a full-scale war between Japan and China. Japanese forces swept into northern China. Despite having 1 million soldiers, China's army led by Jiang Jieshi was no match for the better equipped and trained Japanese. Beijing and other northern cities, as well as the capital, Nanjing, fell to the Japanese in 1937. Japanese troops were horrible. They killed tens of thousands of captured soldiers and civilians in Nanjing. They raped more than 7,000 women. The Chinese were forced to retreat and set up a new capital at Chongqing. At the same time, Chinese guerrillas that were led by China's communist leader Mao Zedong continued to fight the Japanese in the conquered area. Meanwhile, Hitler's growing strength convinced Mussolini of Italy that he should seek an alliance with Germany. In October of 1936, the two dictators reached an agreement that became known as the Rome-Berlin Axis. A month later, Germany also made a tripartite agreement with Japan and Italy. Germany, Italy, and Japan came to be called the Axis powers. That's how we got the Axis powers. In 1931, as Chinese fought Chinese, the Japanese watched this power struggle with a rising interest. Japanese forces took advantage of China's weakening situation of the Civil War. They invaded Manchuria, of course, and in that industrial province in the northeast of China. And in 1937, they launched an all-out invasion of China. Massive bombings of villages and cities killed thousands of Chinese, and the destruction of farms caused many more to die of starvation. By 1938, Japan had held control of a large part of China. The Japanese threat forced an uneasy truce between Jian and Mao's forces. The Civil War gradually ground to a halt as nationalists and communists temporarily united to fight the Japanese. The National Assembly agreed to promote changes outlined in Sun Yat-sen's The Principles of the People: Nationalism, Democracy, and People's Livelihood. Mussolini knew he had to take action at some point, and after declaring war on France and Great Britain, Mussolini moved into France. He took his next step in North Africa. In September of 1940, while the Battle of Britain was raging, he ordered his army to attack British-controlled Egypt. Egypt's Suez Canal was a key to reaching the oil fields of the Middle East. Within a week, Italian troops had pushed 60 miles inside Egypt, forcing the British units back. Then both sides dug in and waited. We need to talk a little bit about German aggression. Hitler had long pledged to undo the Versailles Treaty. Among its provisions, the treaty limited the size of Germany's army. In March of 1935, Hitler announced that Germany would not obey the restrictions, and the League of Nations issued a mild condemnation. The League's failure to stop Germany from rearming convinced Hitler to take even greater risk. The treaty had forbidden German troops to enter a 30-mile wide zone on either side of the Rhine River. This was a demilitarized zone known as the Rhineland. The zone formed a buffer between Germany and France. It was also an important industrial area. On March 7th of 1936, German troops moved into the Rhineland and stunned the French, who were unwilling to risk war. The British urged appeasement, giving in to an aggressor to keep peace, and the Austrians supported unity with Germany. The Treaty of Versailles prohibited Anschluss, or a union between Austria and Germany. However, many Austrians supported this. In March of 1938, Hitler sent his army into Austria and annexed it. France and Britain ignored their pledge to protect Austrian independence. France and Britain were actually preparing for war when Mussolini proposed a meeting of Germany, France, and Italy and Britain in Munich, Germany. The Munich Conference was held on September 29, 1938. The Czechs were not invited. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed that he could preserve peace by giving in to Hitler's demands. Britain and France agreed that Hitler could take the Sudetenland. In exchange, Hitler pledged to respect Czechoslovakia's new border. When Chamberlain returned to London, he told cheering crowds, "I believe it's peace for our time." Winston Churchill, though, a member of the British Parliament, strongly disagreed. He opposed the appeasement policy and warned of its consequences. Hitler later admitted that he would have backed down if the French and the British had challenged him. The German reoccupation of the Rhineland marked a turning point in the march toward war. First, it strengthened Hitler's power and prestige within Germany. And second, the balance of power changed in Germany's favor. France and Belgium were now open to attack from German troops. Finally, the weak response by Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain only encouraged Hitler to step up his expansion. After signing this non-aggression pact with Russia, Hitler quickly moved ahead with his plans to conquer Poland. His surprise attack took place at dawn on September 1st, 1939. German tanks and troops rumbled across the Polish border. At the same time, German aircraft and artillery began a merciless bombing of Poland's capital, Warsaw. France and Great Britain declared war on Germany on September 3rd, but Poland fell some time before those nations could actually get together a military response. After his victory, Hitler annexed the western half of Poland. The region had a large German population, and the German invasion of Poland was the first test of Germany's newest military strategy, that Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It involved using fast-moving airplanes and tanks, followed by massive infantry forces to take enemies' defenders by surprise and quickly overwhelm them. In the case of Poland, the strategy worked. On September 4th, a German U-boat fired on a U.S. destroyer in the Atlantic. In response, Roosevelt ordered Navy commanders to shoot German submarines on sight. The U.S. was not involved now involved in an undeclared naval war with Hitler. To almost everyone's surprise, however, the attack that actually drew the U.S. into the war did not come from Germany, it came from Japan. The fall of France is a really important part of this war. After reaching the French coast, the German forces swung north again and joined with the German troops in Belgium. By the end of May of 1940, the Germans had trapped the Allied forces around the northern French city of Lille. Outnumbered, outgunned, and pounded from the air, the Allies retreated to the beaches of Dunkirk, a French port city near the Belgian border. They were trapped with their backs to the sea. In one of the most heroic acts of the war, Great Britain set out to rescue the army. It sent a fleet of about 850 ships across the English Channel to Dunkirk. Along with the Royal Navy ships, there were civilian crafts, there were yachts, there were lifeboats, there were motorboats, there were paddle streamers, and even fishing boats joined in the rescue effort. From May 26 to June 4th, this amateur armada, under heavy fire from the German bombers, sailed back and forth from Britain to Dunkirk. The boats ended up carrying some 338,000 battle-weary soldiers to safety. Following Dunkirk, resistance in France began to crumble. By June 14th, the Germans had taken Paris. Accepting the inevitable, French leaders surrendered on June 22, 1940. The Germans took control of the northern part of France. They left the southern part to a puppet government headed by Marshal Philippe Pétain, a French war hero from World War I. The headquarters of this government of German collaborators was in the city of Vichy. After France fell, Charles de Gaulle, a French general, set up a government in exile in London. He committed all of his energy to reconquering France. In a radio broadcast from England, de Gaulle called on the people of France to join him in resisting the Germans, saying, "It is the duty of all Frenchmen who still bear arms to continue the struggle. For them to lay down their arms, to evacuate any position of military importance, or to agree to hand over any part of French territory, however small, to the enemy would be a crime against our country." De Gaulle went on to organize the Free French military forces that battled the Nazis until France was liberated in 1944. With the fall of France, Great Britain was alone. They stood alone against the Nazis. Winston Churchill, the new prime minister, had already declared that his nation would never give in. Hitler turned his mind now to the invasion of Great Britain. His plan was to first knock out the Royal Air Force, the RAF, and then to land more than 250,000 soldiers on English shores. In the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe, that's the German Army Air Force, began bombing Great Britain. At first, the Germans targeted airfields and aircraft factories. Then, in September 1940, they began focusing on the cities, especially London, to break the British morale. Despite the destruction and loss of life, the British did not waver. The RAF, although badly outnumbered, began to hit back hard. Two technological devices helped them to turn the tide in the RAF favor. One was an electronic tracking system known as radar that was developed in the 1930s. Radar could tell the number, speed, and direction of incoming warplanes. The other device was a German code-making machine named Enigma. A complete Enigma machine had been smuggled into Great Britain in the late 1930s. Enigma enabled the British to decode German secret messages. With information gathered by these devices, RAF flyers could quickly launch attacks on the enemy. To avoid the RAF attacks, the Germans gave up daylight raids in favor of nighttime bombings. At sunset in London, the wail of sirens filled the air as the Londoners flocked to the subway, which served as air raid shelters. Some rode out the bombing raids at home and in smaller air raid shelters or basements. The Battle of Britain continued until May 10, 1941. Stunned by the British resistance, Hitler decided to call off his attacks completely. Instead, he focused on the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe. The Battle of Britain had taught the Allies a crucial lesson. Hitler's attacks could be blocked. While the German general Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Rat, campaigned in North Africa, other German generals were active in the Balkans. Hitler had begun planning to attack his ally, the one that he signed the non-aggression pact with, the USSR, as early as the summer of 1940. The Balkan countries of southeastern Europe were key to Hitler's invasion plan. Hitler wanted to build a base in southeastern Europe to launch attacks on the Soviet Union. He also wanted to make sure the British didn't interfere. So to prepare for this invasion, Hitler moved to expand his influence in the Balkans. By early 1941, through the threat of force, he had persuaded Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary to join the Axis powers. Yugoslavia and Greece, which had pro-British governments, resisted. In early April of 1941, Hitler invaded both countries. Yugoslavia fell in 11 days, and Greece surrendered in 17. In Athens, the Nazis celebrated their victory by raising swastikas on the Acropolis. With the Balkans firmly in control, Hitler could move ahead with Operation Barbarossa, his plan to invade the Soviet Union. Early in the morning of June 22, 1941, the roar of German tanks and aircraft announced the beginning of the invasion. The Soviet Union was not prepared for this attack. Although it had the largest army in the world, its troops were neither well-equipped nor well-trained. The invasion rolled on week after week until Germans had pushed 500 miles inside the Soviet Union. As the Soviet troops retreated, they burned and destroyed everything in the enemy's path. The Russians had used this scorched earth strategy against Napoleon. On September 8th, German forces put Leningrad under siege. By early November, the city was completely cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. To force a surrender, Hitler was ready to starve the city's more than 2.2 million people. German bombs destroyed warehouses where food was stored. Desperately hungry, the people began eating cattle and horse feed, as well as cats and dogs, and finally crows and rats. Nearly 1 million people died in Leningrad during the winter of 1941 and 1942, yet the city refused to fall. Impatient with progress in Leningrad, Hitler looked to Moscow, the capital and heart of the Soviet Union. A Nazi drive on the capital began in October 2, 1941. By December, the Germans had advanced to the outskirts of Moscow. Soviet General Georgy Zhukov counterattacked. As the temperatures fell, the Germans were in summer uniforms. They retreated, ignoring Napoleon's winter defeat 130 years before. Hitler sent his generals a stunning order: no retreat. German troops had to dig in about 125 miles west of Moscow. They held the line against the Soviets until March 1943. Hitler's advance on the Soviet Union gained him nothing, but cost the Germans 500,000 lives. Most Americans felt that the U.S. should not get involved in the war. Between 1935 and 1937, Congress actually passed a series of what they called the Neutrality Acts. The laws made it illegal to sell arms or lend money to nations at war, but President Roosevelt knew that if the Allies fell, the U.S. would be drawn into the war anyway. In September 1939, he asked Congress to allow the Allies to buy American arms. The Allies would pay cash and then carry the goods on their own ships. Under the Lend-Lease Act passed in March 1941, the President could lend or lease arms and other supplies to any country vital to the U.S. By the summer of 1941, Hitler ordered his submarines to sink any cargo ships they met. Although the U.S. had not entered the war, Roosevelt and Churchill met secretly and issued a joint declaration called the Atlantic Charter. It upheld free trade among nations and the right of the people to choose their own government. The charter later served as the Allies' peace plan at the end of World War II. By October of 1940, Americans had cracked one of the codes that the Japanese used in sending secret messages. Therefore, they were well aware of the Japanese plans in Southeast Asia. If Japan conquered European colonies there, it would also threaten the American-controlled Philippine Islands and Guam. To stop the Japanese advance, the U.S. government sent aid to strengthen Chinese resistance to the Japanese, and when the Japanese overran French Indochina, that's Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, in July of 1941, Roosevelt cut off all oil shipments to Japan and created an embargo. Despite an oil shortage, the Japanese continued their conquest. They hoped to catch the European colonial powers and the U.S. by surprise. So they planned massive attacks on British and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia and on American outposts in the Pacific. At the same time, Admiral Yamamoto, Japan's greatest naval strategist, also called for an attack on the U.S. fleet in Hawaii. It was, he said, quote, a dagger pointed at Japan's throat and must be stopped at all costs. Early in the morning of December 7, 1941, American sailors at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii awoke to the roar of explosives. As a Japanese attack was underway, U.S. military leaders had known from a coded Japanese message that an attack might come, but they didn't know when or where it would occur. Within 2 hours, the Japanese had sunk or damaged 19 ships, including 8 battleships moored in Pearl Harbor. More than 2,300 Americans were killed, with over 1,100 wounded. News of the attack stunned the American people. The next day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress. December 7, 1941, he declared was a date which will live in infamy. Congress quickly accepted his request for a declaration of war on Japan and its allies. Almost at the same time of the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese launched bombing raids on the British colony of Hong Kong, American-controlled Guam, and Wake Islands. They also landed an invasion force in Thailand. The Japanese drive for Pacific Empire was underway. The Japanese experienced a string of victories, which was very disheartening to Americans, and especially American soldiers. The lightly defended Guam and Wake Island fell quickly to the Japanese forces. The Japanese then turned their attention to the Philippines. In January 1942, they marched into the Philippine capital of Manila. American and Filipino forces took up a defensive position on the Bataan Peninsula on the northwestern edge of Manila Bay. At the same time, the Philippine government moved to the island of Corregidor, just to the south of Bataan. After 3 months of tough fighting, the Japanese took the Bataan Peninsula in April, and Corregidor fell the following month. The Japanese also continued their strikes against the British possessions in Asia. After taking Hong Kong, they invaded Malaya, and from the sea and overland Thailand. By February 1942, the Japanese had reached Singapore, strategically located at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. After fierce fighting, the colony surrendered. Within a month, the Japanese had conquered the resource-rich Dutch East Indies, now called Indonesia, including the islands of Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and Celebes. The Japanese also moved westward, taking Burma. From there, they planned to launch a strike against India, the largest of Great Britain's colonies. By the time Burma fell, Japan had taken control of more than 1 million square miles of Asian land. About 150 million people lived in the vast area. Before these conquests, the Japanese had tried to win the support of Asians with the anti-colonialist idea of East Asia is for the Asians, or the Greater East Asia Prosperity Sphere, is what they called it. After victory, however, the Japanese quickly made it clear that they had come as conquerors. They often treated the people of their new colonies with extreme cruelty. However, the Japanese reserved the most brutal treatment for Allied prisoners of war. The Japanese considered it dishonorable to surrender, and they had contempt for the prisoners of war in their charge. On the Bataan Death March, a forced march of more than 50 miles up the peninsula, the Japanese subjected their captives to terrible cruelties. Of the approximately 70,000 prisoners who started the Bataan Death March, only 54,000 survived it. Wherever Allied forces fought, people on the home fronts rallied to support them. In war-torn countries like the Soviet Union and Great Britain, civilians endured extreme hardships. Many lost their lives. Except for a few of its territories, such as Hawaii, the U.S. did not suffer invasion or bombing. Nonetheless, Americans at home made a crucial contribution to the Allied war effort. Americans produced the weapons and equipment that would help them win the war. Churchill and Roosevelt's strategy in Europe varied greatly from what Stalin wanted. Churchill wanted Britain and the U.S. to strike first at North Africa and southern Europe. The strategy angered Stalin. He wanted the Allies to open a second front in France. The Soviet Union therefore had to hold out on its own against the Germans. All Britain and the U.S. could offer in the way of help was supplies. Nevertheless, late in 1942, the Allies began to turn the tide of war both in the Mediterranean and the Eastern Front. General Erwin Rommel, the desert rat that I mentioned before, took the key Libyan port city of Tobruk in June 1942. With Tobruk's fall, London sent General Bernard Montgomery, known as Monty, to his troops to take control of the British forces in North Africa. By the time Montgomery arrived, however, the Germans had advanced to the Egyptian village called El Alamein, west of Alexandria. They were dug in so well that the British forces could not go around them. The only way to dislodge them, Montgomery decided, was with a massive frontal attack. The Battle of El Alamein began on the night of October 23rd. The roar of about 1,000 British guns took the Axis soldiers totally by surprise. They fought back fiercely and held their ground for several days, but by November the 4th, Rommel's army had been beaten. He and his forces fell back. As Rommel retreated west, the Allies launched Operation Torch. On November 8th, an Allied force of more than 100,000 troops, mostly Americans, landed in Morocco and Algeria. American General Dwight D. Eisenhower led this force. Caught between Montgomery and Eisenhower's armies, Rommel's Africa Corps was finally crushed in May 1943. As Rommel suffered defeats in North Africa, German armies also met their match in the Soviet Union. The German advance had stalled at Leningrad and Moscow late in 1941, and the bitter winter made the situation worse. When the summer of 1942 arrived, however, Hitler sent his Sixth Army under the command of General Friedrich Paulus to seize those airfields in the Caucasus Mountains. The army was also to capture Stalingrad, now Volgograd, a major industrial center on the Volga River. The Battle of Stalingrad began on August 23, 1942. The Luftwaffe went on nightly bombing raids that set much of the city ablaze and reduced it pretty much to rubble. The situation looked desperate. Nonetheless, Stalin had already told his commanders to defend the city, named after him, to the death. Closing in around Stalingrad, they trapped the Germans inside and cut off their supplies. General Paulus begged Hitler to retreat, but Hitler refused, saying the city was to be held at all costs. On February 2, 1943, some 90,000 frostbitten, half-starved German troops surrendered to the Soviets. These pitiful survivors were all that remained of an army of 330,000. Stalingrad's defense had cost the Soviets over 1 million soldiers. The city was 90% destroyed. However, the Germans were now on the defensive, with the Soviets pushing them steadily westward. As the Battle of Stalingrad raged, Stalin continued to urge the British and Americans to invade France. However, Roosevelt and Churchill decided to attack Italy first. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces landed on Sicily and captured it from the Italian and German troops after a month of fighting. The conquest of Sicily toppled Mussolini from power. On July 25, King Victor Emmanuel III had the dictator arrested. On September 3, Italy surrendered, but the Germans seized control of northern Italy and put Mussolini back in charge. Finally, the Germans retreated northward, and the victorious Allies entered Rome on June 4, 1944. Fighting in Italy, however, continued until Germany fell in May of 1945. On April 27, 1945, Italian resistance fighters ambushed some German trucks near the northern city of Milan. Inside one of the trucks, they found Mussolini disguised as a German soldier. They shot him the next day and later hung his body in downtown Milan, along with his mistress, for all to see. While the Allies were dealing with issues on the home front, they were also preparing to push toward victory in Europe. In 1943, the Allies began secretly building an invasion force in Great Britain. Their plan was to launch an attack on the German-held France across the English Channel. By May of 1944, the invasion force was ready. Thousands of planes, ships, tanks, and landing craft, and more than 3 million troops awaited the orders to attack. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the commander of this enormous force, planned to strike on the coast of Normandy in northwestern France. The Germans knew that an attack was coming, but they didn't know where it would be launched. To keep Hitler guessing, the Allies set up a huge dummy army with its own headquarters and equipment. This make-believe army appeared to be preparing to attack the French seaport of Calais. Codenamed Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy was the largest land and sea attack in history. The invasion began on June 6, 1944, known as D-Day. At dawn on that day, British, American, French, and Canadian troops fought their way onto a 60-mile stretch of beach in Normandy. The Germans had dug in with machine guns, rocket launchers, and cannons. They sheltered behind concrete walls 3 feet thick. Not surprisingly, the Allies took some heavy casualties. Among the American forces alone, more than 2,700 men died on the beaches that day. Despite heavy losses, the Allies held the beachheads. Within a month of D-Day, more than 1 million additional troops had landed. Then, on July 15th, the Allies punched a hole in the German defenses near St. Louis, and the U.S. Third Army, led by General George Patton, broke out. A month later, the Allies marched triumphantly into Paris. By September, they had completely liberated France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. They then set their sights on Germany. As Allied forces moved towards Germany from the west, the Soviet army was advancing towards Germany from the east. Hitler now faced a war on 2 fronts. In desperate gamble, he decided to counterattack in the west. Hitler hoped a victory would split the American and British forces and break up the Allied supply line. Explaining the reasoning behind his plan, Hitler said, "This is the battle to decide whether we shall live or die. All resistance must be broken in a wave of terror." On December 16th, German tanks broke through the weak American fences along the 75-mile front in the Ardennes forest. They pushed into the Allied lines, gave the campaign its name, the Battle of the Bulge. Although caught off guard, the Allies eventually pushed the Germans back. The Germans had little choice but to retreat, and since there were no reinforcements available at all. After the Battle of the Bulge, the war in Europe rapidly drew to a close. In March 1945, the Allies rolled across the Rhine River into Germany, and by the middle of April, a noose was closing around Berlin. About 3 million Allied soldiers approached Berlin from the southwest. Another 6 million Soviet troops approached from the east. By April of 1945, the Soviets had surrounded the capital and were pounding the city with artillery fire. While the Soviet shells burst over Berlin, Hitler prepared for his end in an underground headquarters beneath the crumbling city. On April 29th, he married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, and the next day Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide. Their bodies were carried outside and burned. On May 7, 1945, General Eisenhower accepted the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich from the German military. President Roosevelt, however, did not live to witness the long-awaited victory. He had died suddenly on April 12th, as Allied armies were advancing toward Berlin. Roosevelt's successor, Harry Truman, received the news of the Nazi surrender. On May 9th, the surrender was officially signed in Berlin. The U.S. and other Allied powers celebrated VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. After nearly 6 long years of fighting, the war in Europe was finally over. But it wasn't over in the Pacific yet. Turning the tide in the Pacific. After a string of victories, the Japanese seemed unbeatable. Nonetheless, the Allies, mainly Americans and Australians, were anxious to strike back in the Pacific. The U.S. in particular wanted revenge for Pearl Harbor. In April of 1942, 16 B-25 bombers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle bombed Tokyo and several other Japanese cities. The bombs did little damage. The raid, however, made an important psychological point to both Americans and Japanese. Japan was vulnerable. Doolittle's raid on Japan raised American morale and shook the confidence of some in Japan. As one Japanese citizen noted, we started to doubt that we were invincible. In addition, some Japanese worried that defending and controlling a vast empire had caused them to spread their resources too thin. Slowly, the Allies began to turn the tide of the war. Early in May 1942, an American fleet with Australian support intercepted a Japanese strike force headed for Port Moresby in New Guinea. The city housed a critical Allied air base. Control of the air base would put the Japanese in easy striking distance of Australia. In the battle that followed, the Battle of the Coral Sea, both sides used a new kind of naval warfare. The opposing ships didn't fire a single shot at each other. In fact, they often couldn't even see one another. Instead, airplanes taking off from the huge aircraft carriers attacked the other ships. The Allies suffered more losses in ships and troops than did the Japanese. However, the Battle of the Coral Sea was something of a victory, for the Allies had stopped Japan's southward advance. Japan next targeted Midway Island, some 1,500 miles west of Hawaii, the location of key American airfields. Thanks to the Allied codebreakers, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, knew that a huge Japanese force was heading toward Midway. Admiral Yamamoto himself was in command of the Japanese fleet. He hoped that the attack on Midway would draw the whole of the U.S. Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor to defend the island. On June 4th, with American forces hidden beyond the horizon, Nimitz allowed the Japanese to begin their assault on the island. As the first Japanese planes got into the air, American planes swooped in to attack the Japanese fleet. Many Japanese planes were still on the decks of the aircraft carriers. The strategy was a success. American pilots destroyed 332 Japanese planes, all 4 aircraft carriers, and 1 support ship. Yamamoto ordered his crippled fleet to withdraw. By June 7, 1942, the battle was over. The Battle of Midway turned the tide of the war in the Pacific. With morale high after the victory at Midway, the Allies took the offensive. The war in the Pacific involved vast distances. Japanese troops had dug in on hundreds of islands across the ocean. General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of the Allied land forces in the Pacific, developed a plan to handle this problem. MacArthur believed that storming beaches on each island would be a long and costly effort. Instead, he wanted to island hop, go past the Japanese strongholds. He would then seize islands that were not well defended but were closer to Japan. MacArthur's first target soon presented itself. U.S. military leaders had learned that the Japanese were building a huge air base on the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The Allies had to strike fast before the base was complete and became another Japanese stronghold. At dawn on August 7, 1942, several thousand U.S. Marines with Australian support landed on Guadalcanal and the neighboring island of Tulagi. The Marines had little trouble seizing Guadalcanal's airfield, but the battle for control of the island turned into a savage struggle as both sides poured in fresh troops. In February 1942, after 6 months of fighting at land and at sea, the Battle of Guadalcanal finally ended. After losing more than 24,000 of a force of 36,000 soldiers, the Japanese abandoned what they came to call the Island of Death. To American war correspondent Ralph Martin and the U.S. soldiers who fought there, Guadalcanal was simply hell. Hell was red furry spiders as big as your fist, enormous rats and bats everywhere, rivers with wading crocodiles, the sour, foul smell of the jungle, and humidity that rotted a body within hours. Hell was an enemy so fanatic that it used its own dead as booby traps. Although the war in Europe was over, the Allies were still fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. With the Allied victory at Guadalcanal, however, the Japanese advances in the Pacific had been stopped. For the rest of the war, Japanese retreated before the counterattacks of the Allied powers. By the fall of 1944, the Allies were moving in on Japan. In October, Allied forces landed on the island of Leyte in the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur, who had been ordered to leave the islands before their surrender in May of 1942, waited ashore at Leyte with his troops. On reaching the beach, he declared, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." Actually, the takeover would not be quite that easy. The Japanese had devised a bold plan to halt the Allied advance. They would destroy the American fleet, thus preventing the Allies from resupplying their ground troops. This plan, however, required risking almost the entire Japanese fleet. They took this gamble on October 23rd in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Within 4 days, the Japanese Navy had lost disastrously, eliminating it as a fighting force in the war. Now only the Japanese army and the feared kamikaze stood between the Allies and Japan. The kamikazes were Japanese suicide pilots. They would sink Allied ships by crash diving their bomb-filled planes into them. In March 1945, after a month of bitter fighting and heavy losses, American Marines took Iwo Jima, an island of 760 miles from Tokyo. On April 11th, U.S. troops moved onto the island of Okinawa, only about 350 miles from southern Japan. The Japanese put up a desperate fight. Nevertheless, on June 21st, one of the bloodiest land battles of the war ended. The Japanese lost 100,000 troops, and the Americans lost 12,000. After Okinawa, the next stop for the Allies had to be Japan. President Truman's advisors had informed him that an invasion of the Japanese homeland might cost the Allies 500,000 lives. Truman had to make a decision whether to use a powerful new weapon called the atomic bomb, or A-bomb. Most of his advisors felt that using it would be end the war as quick as possible. The bomb had been developed by the top-secret Manhattan Project, headed by General Leslie Groves and Chief Scientist Robert Oppenheimer. Truman first heard of the new bomb's existence when he became president. The first atomic bomb was exploded in a desert in New Mexico on July 16, 1945. President Truman then warned the Japanese. He told them that unless they surrendered, they could expect, quote, "a rain of ruin from the air," unquote. The Japanese did not reply, so on August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, a Japanese city of nearly 350,000 people. Between 70 and 80,000 people died in the attack alone. 3 days later, on August 1st, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, a city of 270,000. More than 70,000 people were killed immediately, and radiation fallout from the two explosions killed many more. The Japanese finally surrendered to General Douglas MacArthur on September 2nd. The ceremony took place aboard the U.S. battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. With Japan's surrender, the war had ended. Now the countries faced the enormous task of rebuilding a war-torn world.